Week, Mark Carney and Donald Trump acted like two old friends in the Oval Office.
I want to be a great man, too.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick took a shot at Canada's auto industry. Lutnick spoke at a conference in Toronto where, behind closed doors, he reportedly told the audience that when it comes to the auto sector, it's America first, Canada second.
It began with a threat squarely at the face of Canada's auto sector. When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick made an appearance in Toronto, Washington's message was unmistakable: relocate production south, or else major repercussions. Ontario's response was swift. Premier Doug Ford deemed it a colossal threat, stating that only the president could authorize such a comment. For countless Canadians, this was the instance trade tensions turned personal. But Canada didn't respond angrily, it responded strategically. Quietly, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government started reinforcing the same system Washington was attempting to undermine. The U.S. attempted to dominate North American production, but its tariffs were beginning to interfere with the supply chains American automakers rely upon. The more Washington pushed, the more Canada adjusted and remade itself. To learn how the threat boomeranged, reflect on how intertwined the two economies are. An Ontario-built automobile typically has over 50% of its components supplied by the United States. Meanwhile, the U.S. exports more finished cars to Canada than to any other nation. Each car that comes off a Michigan or Ohio assembly line is part of a web that stretches across the Great Lakes. Ontario alone has about 500,000 workers in auto manufacturing and parts making. These plants aren't standalones. They are part of a shared industrial foundation created over the decades. That's why tariffs slap both sides. A study by the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association forecast U.S. automakers to shell out $188 billion in additional tariffs from 2025 to 2028. Tariffs on components coming from their own Canadian suppliers. Washington anticipated these tariffs to repatriate jobs. Instead, expenses went up, car prices increased, and the slowdown hurt the very states it was intended to save. Canada converted the challenge into strategy. While maintaining a 25% counter tariff against U.S.-produced vehicles, Ottawa made a scheme of incentives available to firms that remained in business and kept jobs in Canada. A $2 billion Canadian Strategic Response Fund assisted workers and producers in weathering the blow. The message was unmistakable: remain and receive assistance, depart and miss out on incentives. Meanwhile, the diplomatic route stayed open. Canadian officials, such as David Patterson, met weekly in Washington with governors, senators, and Congress members to remind them that Canada is the U.S.'s biggest car purchaser. Within Canada, attention turned to resiliency, making EV batteries at home, refining nickel and lithium, and pressuring automakers to make more components locally. The payoff was obvious. Big manufacturers didn't depart, they invested. Volkswagen and Stellantis forged forward with scheduled plants backed by provincial and federal incentives. Japanese and American manufacturers reinforced that Canada's stable labor force, energy supply, and proximity to both markets rendered it a safer long-term home. For the U.S., the outcome came as a surprise. Policies intended to isolate Canada instead emboldened its manufacturing infrastructure. What began as a tariff war turned into a quiet rebalancing, leaving Canada even more autonomous. Unpredictable U.S. tariffs deterred new investment and added costs for American businesses. Analysts put the cost of these policies at up to 6% of U.S. GDP and average wages down by approximately 5%. In contrast, Canada employed selective means to shield its sectors without forfeiting export access. Brian Kingston from the CVMA cautioned that the U.S. cannot win an international competition by battling its closest friends, and that warning is proving accurate. China is quickly upscaling its EV manufacturing, making 3 times more than the domestic demand. North America either lags behind or plays catch-up as a bloc in this worldwide race. Trump's effort to isolate Canada did the opposite. It exposed U.S. reliance on cross-border trade, made vulnerability apparent to increased costs, and demonstrated the minimal amount of control tariffs really afford. All the new taxes intended to shield American jobs actually trimmed into profits and jacked up prices on U.S. consumers. What started as a display of power has become a primer on unintended consequences. Tariffs designed to whack Canada compelled it to innovate, invest, and beef up its industrial base. Ottawa didn't surpass Washington, it survived it. By taking a measured approach to policy and steady-state diplomacy, Canada converted economic pressure into leverage. The larger lesson applies beyond North America. In a networked world, Disruption does not create enduring power. Real strength lies in cooperation, consistency, and credibility. The more vigorously Washington attempted to split the continent, the more obvious it was. North America thrives only when it moves together.
To announce that alongside with the President, we are signing the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. This is our Canada's first ever bilateral trade agreement with an ASEAN country. It's a game-changing agreement. Once it's fully implemented, it means that over 95% of the tariffs on Canada's current exports to Indonesia will be reduced or eliminated.
Canada has just taken an action that indicates it will no longer wait for Washington's approval. In September, Canada and Indonesia sealed a comprehensive economic partnership pact, a whole lot more than a typical trade accord. It wasn't merely a diplomatic gesture. It was Canada's first free trade pact ever with an ASEAN nation, coming at the perfect moment as the United States was imposing higher tariffs under President Donald Trump. The message was obvious. Whereas Washington was closing doors, Ottawa was opening them. This agreement isn't just about one deal. It's Canada signaling that it can no longer rely solely on the American market. It reflects a reality that Trump's tariff-heavy approach has left allies searching for alternatives. Choosing Indonesia was deliberate. With almost 300 million people and a GDP of some $2 trillion US, it's Southeast Asia's biggest economy and forecast by the IMF to become one of the world's top 5 economies within a few decades. For Canada, this is a gigantic new market for services and goods. More than 95% of tariffs on Canadian exports will be eliminated or cut once the agreement comes into full effect in 2026. This provides Canadian farm products, fertilizers, lumber, financial services, and clean technology with a meaningful competitive advantage. The transaction also sets the stage for a collaboration between Export Development Canada and the Indonesia Investment Authority to mobilize private capital of $800 million for infrastructure, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing. It's not just about shipping commodities across the water, it's about integrating Canadian industries into one of the world's most dynamic markets. Indonesia presents strategic interest as well. Located in the center of the Indo-Pacific, it dominates major sea lanes and is in the midst of industrialization. Canadian exporters do not just acquire a market, but a lasting geopolitical presence. For Canada's companies, it's not often that there is a chance to marry commercial expansion with strategic positioning. Timing is everything. Since early September, the Trump administration has made a series of retaliatory tariffs on a broad set of imports. Drugs are now subject to a 100% tariff, with heavy trucks, cabinets, and furniture subject to 25-50% levies. The aim was to bring back jobs to America, but the impact has been that consumers pay more and supply chains are broken on both sides. Canada does business with the U.S. every day of about CAD 145 million. These new tariffs introduce uncertainty and additional cost to Canadian businesses. In that context, the Indonesia deal isn't just good, it's required. It offers tariff-free access, a stable investment climate, and even a defense cooperation aspect that solidifies maritime and cybersecurity relationships. Essentially, Canada is protecting itself from the maelstrom in Washington. For the United States, it is serious. By remaining outside these new frameworks, America stands to lose market share to Canada. Potash fertilizer from Saskatchewan will go to Indonesia. Canadian wood and grain will end up in Jakarta at a lower price. Canada is also linking up with Indonesia's essential mineral industry, especially nickel, crucial to the supply chain for electric vehicles. Indonesia signed a free trade agreement with the European Union during the same week. Both Canada and Europe are drifting towards Jakarta, leaving Washington in the dust. For American workers, the threat isn't simply higher domestic import prices, it's missed opportunities overseas. Rather than bringing partners closer, Trump's tariffs are driving them away. The Canada-Indonesia agreement is the strongest indication yet that allies no longer wait for Washington. They are creating new alliances, testing new markets, and in real terms beginning to take steps on their own.
Pointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship.
The ramifications of a new relationship with the United States are immense. And one thing is clear, we cannot afford to wait this out. Canada needs to do more of that. Canada needs to diversify its trade.
It was hammered home to Canadians over the past few months that their nation is allegedly only a junior partner. The United States ambassador charged Canada with having an anti-American campaign. Donald Trump and his supporters even proposed Canada as the 51st state. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, cars, and agriculture were intended to coerce Ottawa into submission. But the result has been the opposite of what Washington had in mind. Rather than inducing dread, these assaults have mobilized a surge of national determination. Canada is not bending, it is changing. And in doing so, it is becoming more independent than at any moment in recent history. Trump's tariff policy was to exercise hegemony. A 25% tariff on Canadian metals, paired with limits on farm and auto exports, put thousands of jobs in jeopardy. But the Bank of Canada was adamant that holding back for the storm to blow over wasn't on the table. Governor Tiff Macklem informed Saskatoon business leaders that diversification, dropping domestic trade barriers, and tapping more foreign markets is what Canada needs to do. The message was straightforward and blunt. Prosperity cannot be built on reliance. Regular Canadians have reacted in quantifiable ways. By Statistics Canada, the quantity of residents coming back from the U.S. by vehicle in August declined 34% relative to the same month last year, representing the 8th consecutive monthly decrease. Flights to the U.S. declined 25% year over year. Sales of books written by Canadians at Indigo, the country's biggest bookstore, gained 25%. These are not slight cultural adjustments. They represent a population actively making changes in reaction to American pressure. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mark Carney launched the One Canadian Economy Act to eliminate trade barriers within and accelerate national initiatives. What Washington sought to undermine instead propelled accelerated reforms to make Canada a more robust nation. The 51st state comments, echoed by U.S. officials, were designed to remind Canadians how dependent they are. They had the reverse impact. Canadians felt threatened in their identity, and consumers and politicians alike pressed ever harder to be independent. Provinces worst hurt by tariffs, auto-dependent Ontario, aluminum, and softwood-dependent Quebec, saw Canadian campaign support increase in public opinion. Ontario's premier objecting to a Crown Royal bottling relocation to the U.S. demonstrated how symbolic actions reflected the mood of the nation. Even in the provinces such as Saskatchewan and Alberta, where agriculture and oil skirted the highest tariffs, the message remained the same. Canadians desire to see their goods into overseas markets without the aid of American permission. Insult and tariff alike, instead of intimidating, serve to affirm that Canada must stand alone. The trend is unmistakable. Trump's tariffs were designed to try and wring concessions. Rather, they spurred consumer nationalism, consolidated federal and provincial efforts, and diminished the primacy of U.S. trade. Export to the U.S. declined around 2% this year, while exports to other nations increased. That is diversification at work under pressure. Canada is investing in infrastructure as well to transport goods east and west more effectively, so the southern border is no longer sole entry point. Trump hoped to remind Canada of its physical limitations and smaller geography. What he ended up doing was creating momentum for independence. Canadians are shopping differently, holidaying differently, and perceiving differently about their position in the world. Every tariff and jab has become a boomerang of sorts, making a policy of pressure turn into a project of nation-building. By attempting to make Canada the 51st state, Trump might have unwittingly become the designer of a more independent and stronger Canada.